There is a lot of terminology surrounding AI. Instead of assuming you already know what they mean, in this lecture I invite you to briefly go over some of the most important terms that we will be using throughout the course, just to make sure that we are on the same page. And we're going to begin with AI. It is even in OpenAI. AI stands for Artificial Intelligence, and is essentially the simulation of human intelligence by computers. AI enables computers to think like humans and learn new things, solve problems, make decisions, and even create something new which never existed before. AI is a generic term that includes a range of techniques for enabling computers to perform intelligent tasks. The next concept I want to talk about is machine learning. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are related, but still different concepts. Machine learning is considered a subset of AI and refers to the development of algorithms that can learn from a provided dataset without being explicitly programmed. Some machine learning algorithms are modeled around the structure and function of the human brain and are called neural networks. This type of algorithms essentially simulate how the human brain works. In this context, we may also encounter the term deep learning, which is part of machine learning. In conclusion, we can say that machine learning is a technique for achieving artificial intelligence. Let's next talk about machine learning models. A machine learning model, or simply model, is the result of training a machine learning algorithm on a particular dataset. Here is an example to help illustrate this concept. Let's say we want to create a model that can recognize whether an image contains a cat or a dog. First, we need a large dataset of images of cats and dogs. Apart from this, each image needs to have a label indicating if this is a cat or a dog. This is our training dataset. Next, we need to develop a machine learning algorithm which aims to identify some patterns. For example, the shape of the head, the texture of the fur, the eyes, and so on. Initially, our model is dumb. Training is like going to school and learning. The model is learning based on the way the algorithm has been created. The output of this training is a model. This is what the algorithm has learned from the training data. If you provide a new and unseen image, the model should now be able to tell if the image provided is a cat or a dog. So to recap, we develop a machine learning algorithm which can create a machine learning model which we can then use on new data. When dealing with OpenAI, we work with models that are the result of training with a particular machine learning algorithm developed by OpenAI. Let's talk about prompt for a second. A prompt is the input we give to a machine learning model to generate output. In the context of ChatGPT, what you type in that text box is considered a prompt. How we write the prompt plays a critical role in the quality of the response we get from the model. A prompt helps to guide the generation process by providing style, tone, and content. If we tell the model to generate funny responses, this will be part of the prompt. So how we design our prompts plays a key role in how we use a model. Next, we're going to talk about tokens. To process text, a model needs to split it in small chunks it can digest. We call this small chunk of information a token. You can think of a token as a word in a sentence. However, this is not 100% accurate. Special characters like punctuation marks can also be considered tokens. Some words are also broken down into tokens. Let me show you an example. This is the tokenizer from OpenAI, which can help us get an idea of what exactly is a token. So I'm going to go ahead and copy, for example, a text that's already appearing here. I'm going to paste it here in this box. What you will see here below is actually the breakdown of this text in tokens. So almost every word is a token, but there are still some words that need to be broken down into multiple tokens. Acronyms, compound words, and words that have prefixes or suffixes are some examples of words that are broken down into multiple tokens. Now, we don't need to concern ourselves with how this happens exactly. Just having a general idea about this concept is sufficient. In this case, we'll see the is a token, but GPT has been broken down into two tokens. So essentially, every different color represents a token. A comma here is its own token. A dot is its own token, and so on. Essentially, if we're looking at this from a bigger picture, we can say that 100 tokens represent 75 words. We need to know about tokens in the context of working with different models and pricing. The more tokens we use, the higher the cost incurred. The models we'll be using can only process a limited number of tokens. Also, the output generated is limited. I hope this brief introduction to these technical terms was beneficial. Bear in mind that the explanations provided are extremely simplified, as the technology behind AI is quite complex. Check the resources folder for additional details, and if there's anything I've missed, let me know in the Q&A. In this lesson, we will learn how to install Postman. Postman uses a freemium pricing model, and for many use cases, including this course, it is free to use. There are two ways of running Postman. In your browser, it's called Postman on the web, or if you download a standalone app that you install on your computer. There is also an old and deprecated Google Chrome extension. Don't use that one, as you will not be able to follow along with the course. I will be using the standalone app throughout this tutorial, but the browser functionality is very similar. You will find detailed installation instructions in the course notes. The first step you need to take is to go to postman.com and create an account. I highly recommend creating a Postman account, as this will make your life easier. The setup after this is relatively easy. There are just a couple of details you need to enter before you can use Postman, and at this stage I will not create a theme. To use Postman, simply go to Workspaces and select My Workspace. If you wish to use the browser, this is all you need. If you wish to install Postman, you will find an installation kit for Windows, macOS, and Linux. So if you wish to use the Postman app, the next step is simply downloading the app and installing it. When you open the app for the first time, it will look pretty similar to this one. And in order to connect the app with your account, you will have to click here on the Sign In button. Next step, we'll go to Workspaces and select My Workspace. This is essentially where we will organize the work. Postman is actively developed. By the time I finish recording, editing, and publishing this course, a new version will be released. You may notice slight differences from what you see right now in this video. However, I can assure you that the principles stay the same. I will update the videos or the course notes if there's something really important you need to know. The first thing I like to do is switch to a dark theme, which you can do from Settings. The settings are located here. And from the themes, I will select the dark theme. To use the ChatGPT and OpenAI APIs, you need an account with OpenAI. If you have been using ChatGPT, you already have an account. If you are not sure, go to platform.openai.com and try to log in. If you don't have an account, go ahead and create one by clicking on Sign Up. It is important that you complete all the steps I'm going to mention to ensure that you can work with the API. You will need to provide an email address and a password. After this, check your email for a link that confirms your email address. Next, you will need to provide a few details about yourself and agree with the terms of OpenAI. You also need a valid phone number where you can receive a verification text message. Finally, probably for statistical purposes, you will need to say how you plan to use OpenAI. And this is it. You should see this page, which is the starting point for working with the OpenAI API. This is also the page you will be seeing every time you sign in. In this tutorial, we will cover 3 important aspects about working with the ChatGPT API. We will begin by creating an API key which is needed to use the ChatGPT API. Next, we'll make a simple request against the API to get a list of all available OpenAI models. And last but not least, we will build a request against the ChatGPT API. The first thing we need to do is to go to the address platform.openai.com and log in with your account. After you have logged in, you should see a page that is very similar to this one. And here on the top corner, you will see your name initial and you will see personal. If you click on this one, you can go here to view API keys. And this is where we can generate the API key, which we will need to access the API. Initially, you don't have any API keys, so simply go ahead and click on Create New Secret Key and keep this window open for a while. You may need this in case you're losing the API key. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. Now that we have an API key, let's go back to Postman and store it. In order to store this API key, we're going to go ahead and create a new collection. And I'm going to call this collection OpenAI. From the collection, I will see here the option variables. I'm going to close this panel here. Let's go ahead and create a variable which we can call API key. The initial value doesn't really matter, so I'm going to write something like fix me. And in the current value, I'm going to paste the API key which I've copied from platform.openai.com. Let's go ahead and save this. The next step would be to test if our API key is working correctly by sending out a very simple request against the OpenAI API. I'm here at the OpenAI official API documentation, and we'll see here on the left-hand side API reference. This is the part that is describing how the API is supposed to work. And this is something that we're going to use throughout the course because the most updated information is always available here. Of course, this documentation is something that changes a lot, so what you will see when you're watching the course can be slightly different from what I'm showing in the video. So this is why it's important to understand from where I'm getting this information, so that in case something changes, you can put one and one together and figure things on your own. Let's go ahead and get a very simple request to work. And the API has an endpoint, which is the model's endpoint. And this endpoint is very, very simple to call and gives information about all available AI models that OpenAI offers. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to copy this address. I'm going to go back to Postman and open up a new tab. This is a GET request as it says in the API documentation, so there's nothing we need to change about the HTTP request verb. And I'm going to paste this. We'll see in this case, I've introduced here an unwanted character. Whenever we are copy-pasting data, we want to make sure that we are not introducing new lines, spaces, or any other characters that we don't want. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this from here. Now it looks much better. Let's go ahead and send this. And what we'll see here is a very typical error. It's 41 unauthorized. And here in the response body, we're getting a detailed message about what's going on. Essentially, this endpoint requires authorization, which we can provide through the API key. Now, currently, we haven't done this for the request, so this is why it is not working. It's absolutely expected. What we will do next is to save this request in the OpenAI collection by clicking on the Save button. I'm going to name the request Get Models. And I'm going to select the collection OpenAI. Just in case you don't initially see it, make sure that you have saved the collection. And additionally, close this again and click again on Save. It's probably a glitch if you cannot see it. So it's important that we're saving this request inside the OpenAI collection. The fact that we have saved this request inside the collection doesn't mean that this authentication problem is solved, but we can solve this at the collection level because all the requests that we'll be using actually require authentication. So I'm going to go to the collection, and just in case you've closed this tab, you can simply hover over the collection name until this ellipsis shows up. Click on it, this context menu will open up. You will see here Edit. So this will give you access to the variable that we have defined. But additionally, what we want to configure here is actually this authorization. So here, if we click on authorization, currently there's no authorization defined, but we want to select one from the list, and that is bearer token. This is what OpenAI expects from us. So the token is actually stored in a Postman variable. So I'm going to type here 2 braces. And this autocomplete will kick in, and you should see the name of the variable as you have defined it. In my case, is API key. And even if you hover over it, you'll see here the current value, which should be the same as the API key, which you have copied from OpenAI. All right, let's go ahead again and click on Save. Go back to the Get Models request and hit that Send button once again. And what we're actually seeing here is a status 200 OK. And we're going to see here in the response a bunch of models and a bunch of data that we're getting back. This response is formatted as JSON, which is a format used when we're transferring data when using APIs. The model that is being used by ChatGPT is actually called GPT 3.5. So if we go ahead and search in this response for GPT, what we will see here is one of the models available, but this is kind of like a temporary version, so this may go away. It's not considered something stable. We may use it, but it's not the most stable one. So if you search for the next occurrence, we're going to see this one. GPT-3.5-Turbo. So this is the model that we actually want to use. It's always a good idea to use this endpoint to check if the model that you want to use is actually available through the API. And if it's available here, then you know that you can use it. The next step would be to get a very simple request going against the ChatGPT API. So let's jump back to the API documentation. The model behind the ChatGPT API is a bit hidden, and in order to access it, we need to call an endpoint. And information about it we can find here if we select chat. And this is actually called a chat completion. So let me show you what I mean. We need this URL that you see here. And additionally, we need to specify the post recut method in Postman. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this address, go back to Postman, open up a new tab. The first thing that we will do is to select post, because if you forget that, nothing is going to work. The next step is to paste the URL api.openai.com/v1/chat/completions. Make sure you don't add anything after or before this address. It needs to be exactly as you see it. Otherwise, things will not work. Let's go ahead and send it and see how it works. Again, we're getting 4.1 unauthorized, so it definitely not works. The authorization is configured in the collection, so we need to save this request in the collection. Let's go ahead and click on Save. OpenAI is already selected. I'm going to go ahead and name this Chat Completion and hit the Save button. We send it once again. We're going to get another error. This time it's 400 bad request. Whenever we see 400 bad requests, it means that we did something wrong. There's some required data we haven't provided, or the data that we have provided is invalid. So it's always our fault. Additional information about why this is happening is available in the response body. In this case, it says we must provide a model parameter. So in this case, we haven't specified which model do we want to use. In our case, we actually want to use this model here, ChatGPT-3.5-Turbo. So how can we provide this? Let's first copy this value, go back to chat completion, and the next steps are super important, so pay attention to them. We're going to go ahead and select body. After we have selected body, we're going to select raw. After we have selected raw, even more important, we need to select JSON. Do not leave this to text because it's not going to work. Super important that you select JSON because the message that we're sending here is formatted as JSON. So the first thing that we need to submit is actually the model. So this will be a JSON object which starts and ends with a brace. And between double quotes, I'm going to write here model, column, space, and then again quotes. I'm going to write ChatGPT Turbo. Super important that you use double quotes here. Let's go ahead and submit this. And what we're going to get back is again 400 bad request, but this time it's a different error message that we're getting. It says here, messages is required property. So obviously we need to provide the messages property. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to amend our JSON. I'm going to add here a comma. And also between double quotes, I'm going to paste here messages, column. And we're not sure exactly what we're supposed to do here, what we're supposed to provide. So let's jump back at the API documentation, try to understand how to do that. If we're looking here at this endpoint, we're going to see here in the request body, there are two things that we need to provide. Model, this is something that we already provided. And it even says here which models are currently supported. And also messages, which is required for the chat completion. And it needs to be in a specific format. Luckily here, there are also examples that we can simply go ahead and copy paste. However, I wanted to take this approach of you seeing these errors because it's actually an important skill to be able to read the errors that you're getting, figure out what the API is trying to tell you, and then figure a solution on your own. This format itself with the messages here is slightly more complex. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this value that you see here. Go back to Postman and paste it here. You'll notice that in the editor, there's nothing marked red. For example, if I forget here a comma or something like that, this entire thing will appear as invalid. So you'll notice something red here and something red here. If you notice something in red in the editor, do not submit a request because it's not going to work. Check again if you have a valid syntax here and try to figure out what you did wrong, why it doesn't work so well. Apart from this, the way this is written here is not very easy to read. So I'm going to click here on Beautify, and this will make things a bit easier. Now let's go ahead and submit this request as it is. And most importantly, what we see here, we're getting a status 200 OK, indicating, yes, everything worked fine. And apart from this, if we're looking here in the response, what we will see here, it's a bit hidden. There's a lot of additional information that's coming, but we'll see here this message with the content. And this is essentially ChatGPT answering back and say, we have said hello. And the response to our hello is, hello there, how can I assist you today? So now we have managed to call this API. Of course, it's not a super advanced example, but just getting this to work, it's very important. And we're going to start building more on top of this initial call. If at this point in time you got stuck, check the resources folder because I'm going to include my OpenAI Postman collection as a JSON file, which you can easily import. So click here on import and import that file. And all you have to do is click here on the ellipsis, click on edit, go to variables and provide your own API key here. But I hope you managed to get this to work on your own. Let's take a closer look at what has happened in the background as we have called the OpenAI API. Postman has sent a message to the OpenAI server which runs all these AI models, including GPT 3.5. We call this a request as it is requesting some data. The OpenAI server has received a message, the AI model was called, and the server has sent back another message which we call the response. To make this communication possible, we have used HTTP. HTTP is a protocol that enables the client, in this case Postman, and the server which runs the API to communicate. A protocol is essentially a set of rules that both parties need to follow. Most APIs use HTTP, and it is essential to understand some basics around HTTP to be able to read the OpenAI documentation and to use its APIs. Let's jump back to Postman. What you will see here is the address. So this is the address where we're sending this request. And you will see here in the beginning, HTTPS. S stands for secure, so it simply means HTTP secure. For this course and our general interaction with APIs, HTTP and HTTPS are essentially the same. For simplicity, we refer to the protocol as HTTP, but whenever possible, we should use the secure version, HTTPS. Using the secured version, HTTPS, ensures that any data we send is encrypted and nobody can read any messages we send or retrieve. Here is a simplified version of what the request contains. A request will have an address, will have the request method, headers, and a body. And the response will have a status code, headers, and a body. Let's go back to Postman and see where this information can be found. So let's understand where exactly can we configure everything in Postman. Like you will see here on the upper part of the screen, this is where we configure the request. This is essentially the request builder. Here is the endpoint that we're calling, and this is always specified in the API documentation. Apart from this, in front of every action that we want to use, we'll have an HTTP request method or HTTP verb. Typically, when we need to submit JSON, we're going to select here post. When we're only trying to retrieve some data, we're going to have get. There are many other options here, but they will be indicated in the API documentation. All you need to do is see which HTTP method is being indicated and to select it here. Apart from this, there's also a body, which we have already configured here, and this is a JSON body, which will be sent with a request. But apart from the body, we can also send headers. And in order to make our life easier, Postman offers also the possibility of configuring here any query params, but it's very unlikely that we will need this. In the lower part of the screen, this is where we see the response. The response has a body, which is typically what is interesting for us. Apart from the body, we should also care about the status that we're getting back. Status 200 OK, or anything that starts with 2 is a good sign, indicates that everything worked out as we intended. However, if we're getting back 400, 401, or anything else that is unexpected, we need to look into the response body, because typically this is where we're going to find additional details about why this error occurred. So this is just a small indicator something went wrong, and we need to check the response body to see what else has happened. Apart from this, what we'll also see here are the headers, but typically this is not something that will interest us very much. This API expects us to send messages using JSON. So why do we use JSON? Well, we use JSON to transfer data. So for example, if we have here two different systems and they need to communicate, most of the time they will use JSON to do that. So for example, this system here may use a programming language or may have some data, and it is incompatible with this other system. So they will transform any data that they have in JSON, send over a message, and the other system that's receiving this will parse this JSON, will transform it in something else that they can process. So this is why we use JSON to transfer data. Using a format, as I've shown you before, would be very hard to understand by a machine. We humans can understand it, but a machine would have difficulties understanding that. So we need to find a way to structure the data that we're sending. So this is why we're talking about the JSON format. This is a structured format that has a set of rules. Essentially, JSON is a simple key value format. So key value simply means something like first name equals John. First name is the key and John is the value. This is pretty simple. Now, in JSON, we don't use the equal sign, we use a column. So again, first name is the key, John is the value. Now, what happens with JSON is that we put everything between quotes, otherwise it is not valid. So you'll see here, both the key and the value are now between quotes. To make it even more valid JSON, we would also add this curly brackets, and essentially this will create an object that has only one property. So this object will have the property first name and the value would be John. So quite easy to understand. Most of the time we don't have just one property, And if we add an additional property, we will put a comma after the line above. So you will see here this comma. I marked it in red so that you can easily see it. And below I have added another property. The name of the property is age and the value is 22. Now, as you can notice, 22 is not between quotes. And the reason for that is 22 is a number. So that's quite an important difference. Now, John here, we call it a string, it's simply a text. But 22 has a significance. It is a number, and it can also be understood as a number. The same goes for a Boolean value. You see here I've added a new line and also added a comma here. And this one, false, is a Boolean value. So a Boolean value can be true or false. So we don't put numbers in quotes. We don't put Boolean values in quotes. Now the beauty of JSON is that it is both readable by humans as well as by computers. So that's a big advantage. In terms of commas, make sure you don't add a comma here on the last line, because if there's nothing following after this, this will be invalid JSON. Now, the term invalid JSON is very important. If you don't write valid JSON, the other party will not be able to understand you. For example, if you use single quotes instead of double quotes, this will be invalid JSON. If you don't put all the commas where they should be, this will create invalid JSON, and so on. Now, you may also encounter something like these square brackets here. And these square brackets indicate a list, or how it is often called, an array. It means simply a list of values. In this case, it is a list of strings. Netflix is a string, and then this is comma separated. You will see here the comma, and there comes the next value. This can be numbers, this can be objects, so you can store many things in there. You may encounter objects represented by a curly bracket, or you may encounter list represented by brackets. So this is essentially, in a nutshell, the JSON format. So now let's recap a bit, because I really want to make sure that you understand this. And it is super important because you will be working with JSON quite a lot, and any mistakes or misunderstandings that you have about JSON will impact the way you work with APIs. So again, first name, this is what we call a key. Age is a key, is married is a key, hobbies, they're all keys. On the other side, we have separated by a column values like John. John is a string. On the next line, it's very important that we don't forget this. Add a comma. Age, 22. This is another value, which is a number. False is a Boolean. And what we have here below, Netflix, mountain biking, they are strings in an array. So we have here an array of strings. And of course, everything is encapsulated in an object. You see here at the beginning and at the end, this indicates an object. Now, let's see if you really understood this, and take a look at another example. What is this here? Now, it's important that you look from the beginning. What is the first sign that you're seeing here? Well, you're seeing a bracket. So a bracket here and a bracket here indicate an array. So we have an array. We have a list of something. And then we're looking, what is the first thing that we're seeing here? And of course, this will be an object. So this here are objects. They are separated here by a comma, which is again very important. So essentially, we have here an array of objects. So by using JSON, we can send data to an API, but you can also retrieve data and use that in various ways. So it is very important that the JSON that we send is valid. Otherwise, we will not be able to understand it, or the other party will not be able to understand it. Have you ever wondered what GPT stands for in ChatGPT? GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Well, that's not so easy to understand, but let's begin with the last word, transformer. A transformer is a type of a neural network that is designed to process natural language text, like a book or a newspaper article. The transformer uses a special technique to transform the words and sentences into a new representation which captures the important information that is needed to understand the meaning. It's like a small summary. It transforms the text. This approach is super useful for tasks such as language translation, question answering, and text generation. Let's go to the P now, pre-trained. A pre-trained model is a machine learning model that has been trained on a large dataset and which can be fine-tuned to a new task or dataset. This is useful for us since we don't need to train a model from scratch. We can use an existing model and fine-tune it to match our own needs. Finally, G, generative. Generative refers to the ability of the model to generate new text that is similar in style and content to the dataset it was trained on. For example, if we train a model on all New York Times news articles, we can use this model to generate new news articles that are similar in style and content to the original New York Times articles. So GPT is an artificial intelligence model that is pre-trained and can understand text and generate new text that looks like it has been written by humans. Of course, this explanation is extremely simplified as the technology behind this is extremely complex. However, I do hope that now you have a better idea what GPT in ChatGPT actually stands for. We've been talking about ChatGPT and OpenAI previously, but let's briefly clarify the difference between ChatGPT and OpenAI. ChatGPT is an artificial intelligence language model and the name of the chat app that uses this model. ChatGPT is developed by a company called OpenAI. OpenAI is a research organization dedicated to artificial intelligence. Due to the success of ChatGPT, these names have almost become synonymous. Apart from ChatGPT, OpenAI also has other products which offer artificial intelligence models for various use cases, like image generation with DALL-E or transcribing audio files with Whisper. So in a nutshell, OpenAI is the company, while ChatGPT is one of their products. Welcome to this section where we'll go a bit deeper into the models offered by OpenAI through the API. The goal of this section is to give you an overview of the most popular models and show you a brief example. OpenAI provides a series of models, each trained to have a specific capability. For example, the ChatGPT application uses a model which is called GPT 3.5 Turbo. This model can be used for chat, but also for many other tasks. GPT 3.5 Turbo is also the most advanced language model from OpenAI. GPT 3.5 refers to a set of models which can understand and generate natural language or code. While there are also other models in this set, GPT 3.5 Turbo is the most advanced one. So, as long as we work with text or code, using one of these models makes sense. This is where we'll be spending most of our time. However, not all models generate text. For example, DALL-E is a model that can generate images based on a given prompt that provides a description. Whisper is a text-to-speech model that can take as an input an audio file and transcribe it. Some models are built only for generating code, such as the models listed under Codex. For example, GitHub Copilot is powered by Codex. There's also a series of GPT-3 models, which are not to be confused with the latest generation, GPT 3.5. GPT-3 models are an earlier generation of models that can understand and generate natural language, but are currently obsolete. Their training data is also much older, so we won't be paying a lot of attention to them. So in a nutshell, this is what we'll be covering in this section. Generally speaking, models that can understand and generate text can be used for virtually any task. However, if we were to make a general classification, the following categories of tasks would come to mind: chat completions, general text completions, and code completions. Let's talk about the word completions for a second. In this context, a completion refers to generating new text that is similar to the text which was used to train the AI. Let's say that we provide the following prompt. Write a title for a blog article explaining how to use the ChatGPT API. In this case, the completion can be something like this. Unlocking the power of ChatGPT, a step-by-step guide to using the ChatGPT API. This is called a completion because the model uses probabilities to predict which word is likely to follow the one before it. So this is why text generated by these AI models is so human-like. Let me give you some other examples of completions. Asking the model to brainstorm ideas for what you can cook with a list of ingredients. Providing factual responses. Translating text. Or providing a summary of a larger text. And many other use cases. So completion is a more general term of tasks that a model can perform, while, for example, a chat completion is a more specific task. It's about interacting with a model in a conversational way. If we ask a model to generate programming code, this is also a completion. It is called a code completion. I hope that now you have a better understanding of the concept of completions when dealing with these AI models. In this lecture, I wanted to show you an important tool when working with OpenAI models. This is the OpenAI Playground. You will find a link in the resources folder that takes you to this page. You can also access this page by going to platform.openai.com and clicking on that Playground button from the top menu. The OpenAI Playground is essentially an intermediary step to using the OpenAI APIs. It allows us to get familiar with the different models available and interact with them in an easy way. Let me give you a brief overview of the interface that you see here. First of all, there are different kinds of modes that we can select. By default, the chat mode is selected, but there's also the complete mode and the edit mode. We'll be mostly working with the chat and the complete modes. When you select one of these modes, you will have a list of available models that you can use. For example, if you want to use the model that ChatGPT uses, you will have to select the chat mode, and you will see here a list of available models, including GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4. Apart from this, there are also some settings that we can control. These settings allow us to change the behavior of the model. This is something that's not available when using the ChatGPT UI. For some of the models here, OpenAI also provides examples, and this will be visible here in the select box where it says load a preset. Now you'll see here that this is currently grayed out, and at the time of this recording, ChatGPT does not provide any examples for the chat mode. So if you want to see the examples that OpenAI offers, you will have to select here the complete mode, and this will load a different set of models. By default, we'll see here Text DaVinci 003, and if you now click on this preset select list, you will see here a list of examples. So these are different examples on how you can use this particular model. Some of the models that we have here have been created with a specific task in mind. For example, models such as GPT 3.5 or GPT-4, as the mode implies a bit, they are chat models. So they are designed for chat usage. But don't worry, they can also be used for more generic purposes, as I will be demonstrating throughout the course. In this section, we'll be working with the OpenAI Playground, and in this lecture, I just wanted to briefly introduce you to this tool. GPT 3.5 is the term used to refer to the latest generation of models designed to work with natural language or programming code. ChatGPT uses the GPT 3.5 Turbo model which is the most advanced language model. When working with the API, don't get distracted by the fact that this model is available under chat completions. You don't need to build a chatbot. With this model, you can write a response to an email based on a discussion thread, write JavaScript code, translate text from one language to the other, make a summary of a longer text, or fix grammar or spelling mistakes in a text. And of course, you can create chatbots, but many other things. This chat model receives a sequence of messages as input and produces a new message as its output. Let me show you what I mean by opening the OpenAI Playground. Here inside the Playground, the first thing that we will do is to select the mode. So the mode that we are interested in order to use this GPT 3.5 Turbo model is to select here Chat. And we'll see here which are the models available. When working this particular model, the API gives a bit more structure compared to other models. The messages that we're sending are essentially attributed to 3 different roles. There is a system role, there is a user role, and what comes back from the AI assistant is the assistant role. The system role is only used once to set a context and configure the behavior of the assistant. A very general way to configure this is just by saying you are a helpful assistant. Next, we have a message with a user role, and here is the content. For example, how many states does USA have? Let's go ahead and submit this. And what comes back from the AI model is a message attributed to the role assistant, and it says the United States of America has 50 states. So these are the messages. This is one message with the system. This is the second message with what the user is asking. This is the third message that comes back from the AI model. While these messages are not necessarily mandatory, this structure is very useful when working with this particular model. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we can configure this model to translate text, for example. We can specify something like, you're a helpful assistant that translates English to German. So let's go ahead and delete this previous message that we have. And we're going to change this current one. For example, let's translate this text. Where is the train station? Let's go ahead and click on Submit. And we're going to get the version in German. Wo ist der Bahnhof? This is how we now have used this system message to essentially change the behavior of this model. If, for example, we were to remove something, so for example, we are leaving this translation part aside, let's go ahead and remove this message. I'm going to click here on Submit. We're going to get something else back. So this is why the system message is very important for giving that context, for giving that initial instruction to the model to understand what are we trying to do essentially. Let's go back to Postman and try to implement this exact example. I'm going to go back to the OpenAI collection and open the existing chat completion. We are here inside the body, and these are the messages that we're sending. So we can see here we have this messages array. We currently have only one message. Each message has 2 properties, role and content. Let's begin first with the system message. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the structure that we already have. Add here a comma to make this valid JSON. And we're going to change here the role from user to system. So let's say you want to implement the example where we're translating. So the content of the message will be, you're a helpful assistant, and you're translating from English to German. We can jump back to the playground, copy the message that we had there, and simply paste it here. Now, next with the user role, this is essentially what the user is asking. This is what we want the AI to do. So let's go ahead and change hello and replace it with this message that we have here, which is asking where is the train station. So what we expect this to do is, as in the playground, to translate this into German. Let's go ahead and send it. And we're going to take a look at the response. And what we're going to see here is a message. Role is assistant, so this is coming back from the assistant. And it's telling us this is a translation in German of what we have provided in English. Of course, if we want to build a conversational bot, we need to supply the entire conversation history. So for example, if we're asking here a few questions and the context is necessary for the model to provide the next message, also need to provide here as an existing message what the model has answered earlier. For this case, we don't need this, but for a conversational bot, that would definitely be very important because without supplying the conversation history, the model has no recollection of past interactions. So the model, we can say in some regards, is stateless, doesn't know what we have asked previously. Now, this was just a simple example to get started with this and to understand how we can configure these messages, but we're going to explore this model in a dedicated section. OpenAI has recently introduced the latest iteration in their lineup, GPT-4. This advanced model takes a step up from its predecessor, GPT 3.5, bearing many resemblances while also sporting new enhancements. The promise from OpenAI is that GPT-4 is adept at more creative and complex tasks. Primarily, GPT-4 serves as a chat model. Yet, as we'll explore throughout the course, it also excels with what we might refer to as traditional completions. If you're a ChatGPT Plus subscriber, you've likely noticed the option to toggle between the modes. So you have the option GPT 3.5 and also GPT-4 with a brief explanation between the two different models. However, it is worth noting that GPT-4 became widely available through the API only as of July 6, 2023. To access it, you need to have completed a billing cycle through the OpenAI API platform. This model is exclusively available to paying customers. If you are on a free trial plan, this model will not be accessible to you. Before we proceed, I would like to clarify that your ChatGPT Plus subscription and the OpenAI API are distinct products, each with its own billing. Just because you can use GPT-4 within your ChatGPT application, it does not mean that GPT-4 is also available for you through the API. Finally, let me show you how you can use the GPT-4 models in Postman. So the first step that we need to do is to ensure that you actually have access to the GPT-4 models. So we're going to go to the Get Models request, and we're going to take a look at the response body to see if we can find anything with GPT-4. The fastest way is to simply search for GPT-4. So I'm searching now for GPT-4. And I'm going to see here in the response, this is a variation of the GPT-4 model. So there are different versions essentially, but the one that we want to use is this generic one, GPT-4. So let's go ahead and go to the same request where we have used GPT 3.5. The message structure is absolutely the same. So all we have to do here is replace the model from GPT 3.5-turbo to GPT-4. So we can go ahead and send out this request. And we're going to see we're getting back a status 200 OK. And the response structure is the same as with GPT 3.5. My hope is that this lecture has somewhat demystified GPT-4 for you, aiding in a more comprehensive understanding of its functionality and potential applications. We're going to have a dedicated section where we're going to go deeper into both GPT 3.5 and GPT-4. I had the privilege of testing GPT-4 months before its general release, courtesy of an invite from OpenAI. Based on my evaluation, the differences between GPT 3.5 and GPT-4 aren't as stark as one might expect. In practical terms, and for many use cases, the distinction between the two versions isn't particularly substantial. In this course, any discussions or concepts relating to GPT 3.5 largely apply to GPT-4 as well. GPT-4 maintains the same message structure, including the 3 different roles, as GPT 3.5 does. But given that it is a distinct model, its behavior also shows slight variations. One standout feature of GPT-4 is its image processing capability. Unfortunately, this feature is currently not accessible via the API, somewhat limiting the potential applications. Now, just because GPT-4 is the latest model and has been a hot topic of discussion, it doesn't automatically mean it's superior in all aspects. For instance, GPT-4 is somewhat slower than GPT 3.5, and using it incurs a higher cost. Another key point to remember is that GPT-4 training data is up to September 2021, which is the same as GPT 3.5. Unless your interest lies in ancient Rome, a couple of years can be substantial, especially in the ever-evolving IT sector. So I see this rather as a disappointment. Speaking from personal experience, I've switched between the models quite a lot, but I'm still not fully convinced by GPT-4, at least for the projects where I use OpenAI. That said, GPT-4 does excel in one crucial area. It can process larger volumes of text compared to GPT 3.5. So for example, if we look here at GPT-4, we're going to see here that the GPT-4 model has a maximum of 8,192 tokens. So this is what the model can process. Now, if we compare this to GPT 3.5, it's only half of that. And apart from this, there's also some variations on the GPT-4 model, which can have up to 32,000 tokens. And trust me, this is absolutely massive if we compare it to GPT 3.5. The main takeaway here is the necessity to critically evaluate and determine which model best suits our specific needs. It is less about good versus bad, but more what's different and what's more applicable. In this lecture, we'll be using the Text DaVinci 003 model, which is also part of the GPT 3.5 generation of models. Let's first interact with this model through the OpenAI Playground. In the Playground, make sure that the mode is complete. And additionally, from the list of models, select Text DaVinci 003. What we see here, this big window, this is essentially the prompt. We provide any input that we need through the prompt. So this model has a very simple interface. Let's go ahead and write the first prompt. Let's say that we are writing a blog article about the ChatGPT API, and we are looking for a good title. We can write a prompt which is something like, write a title for a blog article explaining how to use the ChatGPT API. Let's click on Submit. And what we'll see here in green is the response from the model. If we don't delete the response from the model and click on Submit once again, we're going to get this error here. So essentially, it's telling us there's nothing else that the model can do right now. So if we want to run this again to get maybe a different idea for a blog title, have to remove that and click here once again on Submit. Text completions can also be used for transforming text using, for example, translations. Let's say, for example, we want to translate a text in German. So we can say, translate the following text in German. So let's say the text I want to translate is, I've missed a train because I couldn't find the train station. And let's click on Submit to see the translation. So this is a translation in German. Another form of translation is to ask the model to provide a summary of a longer text. So for example, we can write a prompt which says something like, summarize the main idea from this text and explain it in simple terms. I'm going to go to Wikipedia and grab here a chunk of text from an article about OpenAI. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it here. Let's click on Submit. And what we'll see here in green is essentially the summary that we have requested, which is a transformation of this original text that we have provided. But we can also use text completions for generating new ideas. Let's say, for example, we're looking for a present. So how about a prompt like brainstorm some ideas for Christmas gifts for my friend who likes Star Wars? So let's click on submit and see what are the ideas that we have for gifts. And even if this model is not explicitly designed for conversations, we can even use it for conversations. So for example, we can provide some context and tell the AI, you're a friendly and funny AI assistant named Mike. And then what we can do is start essentially a conversation. So we can write here me, for example. I'm going to write a message like, hello, how are you? I'm going to write here AI column. I'm going to go ahead and click on submit. And then what we're getting back is, hi there, I'm doing great. How can I help you? Right? So then I'm going to write again me. How many states are in the USA? As a question. So the conversation continues. Now let's go into Postman and try and figure out how we can submit a request through the API to the TextDaVinci 003 model. The first thing that we need to do is to go to the API documentation, and this model is available for looking here in the API reference under the completions endpoint. So to use the completions endpoint, we need to submit a post request against this endpoint. So let's go ahead, copy this address, and what we'll do is go to Postman and create this request from scratch. I'm going to open up a new tab, select post so that we don't forget, and paste this address here. Let's go ahead and save this inside the collection so that we have access to the API token. I'm going to name this request text completion, and after that, I'm going to also specify the name of the model. Let's go ahead and click on save. So if we're submitting this request as it is right now, we're going to get back an error telling us we haven't specified the model parameter. So obviously this is something that we need to do. So we're going to go here to body, I'm going to select raw, and instead of text, we have to select JSON because we are sending JSON. I'm going to start here a new object, and between double quotes, I'm going to write model. And then the model that we want to use is TextDaVinci 003. If you're unsure if this model is available, go to Get Models, run this request, search here for TextDaVinci. There are multiple versions, but the one that we are interested in is this one. I'm going to go ahead and copy the name and take it here in the request. Let's go ahead and send this again. What we're going to get back here is already a completion, even though we have provided no input. So this is just some random thing that's coming back. It doesn't really matter so much. But actually what we want to do is to provide a prompt, right? We want to provide some instructions. So if we go to the API documentation, we're going to see here that the model is required, but the prompt itself is not. This is a bit surprising, but this is the way this endpoint works. So let's go ahead and copy the name prompt and provide this as a prompt. I'm going to add here comma, and between double quotes, I'm going to write prompt. And let's say we're going to start with a very simple prompt. I'm going to use the example with write a title for a blog article explaining how to use ChatGPT API. So this is the prompt that I provided here. Let's go ahead and click on send. And we're going to see here inside choices, this is essentially the response that we're interested in. And the suggestion is a step-by-step guide to using the ChatGPT. Okay, maybe not so good. Let's try it once again. And we're going to get here a different version that we can use. So this already looks much, much better. So under the GPT 3.5 models, we have GPT 3.5 Turbo, and we also have TextDaVinci 003. Now the question is, why use TextDaVinci 003 over GPT 3.5 Turbo? If GPT 3.5 Turbo is so great, why use something else? Well, actually, for most cases, using GPT 3.5 Turbo is a good place to start. Currently, it is also 10 times cheaper than TextAvinci 003. However, there is no best for all use cases, and it is important to try out the different completion models to see which one provides better results for the kind of use cases that you have. TextAvinci 003 is optimized for traditional completions and not necessarily for chat usage. Apart from this, TextAvinci 003 is a model that can be customized based on specific needs through a process which is called fine-tuning. Essentially, you're providing additional data to the model and you're kind of like continuing the training. This is something that currently in the GPT 3.5 Turbo model is not possible. Apart from this, there's also the aspect of speed. Some responses generated by GPT 3.5 Turbo may take longer. I had instances where it took the API even 10 or 12 seconds to generate a response. While the response generated was great, this long waiting time may be an issue for some use cases. So this is why it's not about which model is best, but it's more about which model is best for you and what you're trying to build. DALL-E is an AI model that can generate images based on a text prompt. You won't find the DALL-E model in the OpenAI Playground. If you want to play with DALL-E outside of an API, you need to go to labs.openai.com to get to the labs interface. I've included a link in the resources folder. So these are some examples of images that have been generated with DALL-E. And I must say, I'm quite impressed about their quality, but obviously the prompts are very important. But let's see if we can generate something decent. So this is where our prompt is for this model. And let's say, because we're using Postman, let's try to get an impressionist oil painting of a postman carrying the letter. And let's go ahead and generate this image. And it will take a bit for this to generate. So we'll have to wait for a few seconds. So these are already 4 images that have been generated based on our prompt. And I would say at least one of them looks pretty decent. If I didn't know that this is AI generated, I would have thought that this was actually something someone has painted. Okay, enough playing with this. Let's use the API to generate this image. The DALL-E model is available through the Images API. So if we scroll here down to the API reference, we'll find here images. And in order to actually create an image, we'll have to use a post request against this endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this endpoint directly and jump into Postman. Let's open up a new tab. So we're going to select here post, and this is the URL that we have. Let's also go ahead and save this. I'm going to call this images-DALL-E. All right, so let's go ahead and send this to see what are the required information. So currently we haven't submitted here JSON object, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to select here body, raw, and select JSON. That's the first step. Let's also create an empty object and send that over. So prompt is obviously a required property. In this case, we don't need to specify here a particular model because this is probably automatically selected to this model that is generating the images. So let's provide here a prompt. I'm going to give here the prompt that I've used earlier, which is to generate an impressionist oil painting of a postman carrying the letter. And let's go ahead and submit this. So what we're going to get back is the response. And we'll find here the link to this image. So in order to actually see the image, we'll have to click on it. In Postman, this will open up a new tab. We'll have to click here on send. So we're essentially just fetching this image that is here. And this is the image that has been generated. Jumping back at the API documentation, we can even see here what is part of the request body. So obviously the prompt is required. There are also a few things that we may want to do. For example, in one request, we can generate multiple images. by specifying the n parameter. And just as well, we can also specify here the size of the images. Maybe initially we want only smaller images, don't want to wait so long for larger images to be generated, so it may make sense to have a smaller image. So let's add this to our request. I'm going to close this tab because we don't need this anymore. And here from the body, I'm going to add here a new property. So comma, this is n, so it indicates how many images we want to get. Let's say we want 4 images. And the next property from the API documentation is size. And we need to specify here the size as a string. So let's take just the smallest image. I'm going to paste it here. Okay, so now we should get back 4 images from this API. Let's see how it works. Now we'll see here in the response body under data, we have an array and we are getting 4 images back. So let's click on one of them, submit this request, and we'll see here the image is much smaller. So this is one of the images, the second one, yeah, and so on. So essentially, this is a very nice API for quickly generating some images based on a prompt. The interface is quite easy, and I would say the results are quite impressive. Whisper is an AI model that can turn audio to text, and after the first experiments, I must say that I'm quite impressed by its capabilities. Currently, this model is not available through the Playground or any other web interface, so what we'll need to do is to directly use the API. So let's jump here into the API documentation, and this will be part of the audio. I'm going to click here on audio. And what we'll see here is the endpoint that allows us to create a transcription. So let's go ahead and copy this endpoint. And again, please note that this is a post request. I'm going to open up a new tab and also select here post after pasting the URL. Let's go ahead and save it in the OpenAI collection. And I'm going to call this audio transcription Whisper API. Let's take a look again at the API documentation and see what is required and what is not. So first of all, we need to specify the model, and we also need to specify a file that we want to transcribe. So let's begin with the model. Currently, it says that only this Whisper 1 model is available, but we should do an effort to see if this model is actually available through the API. So I'm going to simply go ahead and copy this, open the get models endpoint, and send this request. Let's go ahead and search for this model, and we'll find it here, Whisper 1. Okay, so this is the name of the model, which means we are on the right track. So what we need to do is go here inside body, and this time we're not going to send this as JSON because we need to upload a file. So what we need to do actually is to select form data, and here we're going to write one key, which is the model. And I'm going to paste the value Whisper1, which I got from the getModels endpoint. And the next required key that we need to provide is file. So if we see here again the API documentation, we have file and model. Both are required. You can also provide a prompt, but this is optional, so we're not going to do it initially. So let's go ahead and provide here file. So how do we upload this file here in Postman? Well, this is not so super intuitive. So I want you to pay a bit of attention. As I'm hovering over file here, you would see here text appearing. Actually, when you click on text, this drop-down opens up. You will see here two options, text and file. So text is by default, and file is what allows us to actually upload the file. So once again, normally you don't see anything here if you don't hover over it. But once you put your mouse over this, you will see here text. So let's go ahead and select file. And now we have this select files open. So what I'm going to do is going to click on select file and select the file that I want to transcribe. To make your life easier, if you don't have an audio file, I've already included an audio file in the resources to this lecture, so you can simply download that and use it in this example. So this is how it looks like with this file selected. So model and file, we have both required properties that we need to send to this endpoint. So let's go ahead and click on send and see what is happening. And actually what we're getting back, super simple, is the transcription of the audio file that we have provided here. What you need to keep in mind is that the maximum size here is 25 megabytes of data that you can send at once. So it's, of course, ideal to work with audio files in this case, not with a video file or something like that, which is much larger. And also when you're working with files, so compress the files to make them as small as possible if you have, for example, something longer that you want to put into text. So in a nutshell, this is how we can work with the Whisper API to take an audio file and get the text out of it. The quality of the output we get from a model is directly proportional to the quality of the prompt. Because the models are very powerful and can do many things, we need to be very explicit in describing the desired output. If our prompt is short and unspecific, so will be the result. I'm here inside OpenAI Playground, and I have selected here the chat mode, and I have the ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo model selected. So let's say, for example, I have a new cat, and I want a name. So I can simply ask here, suggest a name for the cat. I would say this is rather unspecific. But let's say, if we continue clicking on submit, we're going to get different suggestions for cats. So this is essentially more or less the most common name for cats, or whatever the model thinks that are very common names for cats. Now, essentially, this is maybe not what we're looking for because our cat is actually white. So let's be more specific and say we want a name for a white cat. Now, if we click on submit, we're going to get here results that are much better suited to what we are actually looking for. Generally speaking, we can guide a model in different ways. When we're creating the prompt, we can provide clear and detailed instructions. Additionally, we can guide the model by providing examples so that the model better understands the kind of output we're looking for. Apart from this, most models also have additional settings that we can change a bit to change how, for example, creative the model is by adjusting the temperature of the model. But it's important to remember that even if you provide the same prompt to an OpenAI model, that model will rarely return the same answer. Of course, for example, when you're looking for a white cat, it's only probably a limited number of answers that you're going to get back. But essentially, it's very rarely that you will get the exact same answer based on a specific input. Technically speaking, we say that the model is non-deterministic. So the main idea of this lecture is that don't expect to get fantastic results if you don't spend a bit of time in properly designing your prompts and understanding a bit how the model reacts and how it's working. The shorter the prompt, the more generic and probably less useful the response from the model is. In general, models such as GPT 3.5 Turbo are non-deterministic. This means that the exact same prompt may generate slightly different results, and this is expected. These models work based on probabilities, like what is the most probable name for a white cat? And if we run this a few times, we'll see the most probable name for a white cat is Snowball. However, this is not very useful. We want something more creative. Creativity in terms of AI models means taking more risks and potentially providing inaccurate answers. To control this creativity, most models have a temperature setting. This temperature setting can be controlled through the API or here through the Playground. To control this creativity, most models have a temperature setting, which is a value from 0 to 2. For some unknown reason, the Playground has a maximum of 1, which is anyway the default value when using the API. Let's go to the API and take a look at how this temperature has an impact on the result. I've changed here a bit the chat completion endpoint, and I have here the system prompt, which is essentially saying you're a helpful assistant, Now I'm trying to get a name for a white cat. And I've set here the temperature to 0 by adding this additional property to the request body. So let's go ahead and run this and see what is coming out. If we're taking a look here at the response, we're going to see we're getting back Snowball. Let's run this once again. And again, we're getting back Snowball. So as I said earlier, with a temperature of 0, which means almost zero creativity, Snowball is the most probable name for a white cat. However, this is not useful in this case. I want really a creative name. I want something else from the model. So in this case, I'm going to set the temperature to 2. So this is the maximum temperature that this model allows. So let's go ahead and see what is happening then. So now we see that the model is starting to provide different values. Let's give it another try. So now we have essentially managed to get a bit different values. But, in some situations, it's like you're wondering, like, what's coming back here, right? So it's not always what we get from the model when we are having so much creativity is something that we want to use directly in an application, because then if this is a chat application or something like that, the users will be like, this is gibberish, doesn't make any sense. But I just want to briefly demonstrate like the extremes between no creativity and, let's say, maximum creativity, where things can really go crazy. So if we set a temperature of 0, the model will almost certainly return the same output. Essentially, it takes no chances. And this is ideal if you're looking for factual responses. However, this may also make the responses that the AI is generating look like the same every time. So there's no changes in them. They may get all the responses. For some applications, this is also not needed, because when you're interacting with a system, or let's say, for example, you're building a chatbot, when you're interacting with a human being, it's not going to say the same thing over and over again. You want to add a small variation to this. For very short prompts, changing the temperature may not always make such a difference, but it really depends a bit. Of course, if you're designing more complex prompts and you're still noticing repetitions, you may want to take a look at increasing the temperature. However, word of caution, and here's a good example for that, a high temperature may also generate incorrect answers or things that make no sense. So by increasing the temperature, the model will consider options with a lower probability. A lower probability means that things are not always correct. So in a nutshell, this is an introduction to the temperature, and it's an important setting that you should be familiar with and also start playing around with. OpenAI charges based on usage, or to be more exact, depending on the amount of data the model had to process. A model works with tokens, and the API pricing is calculated based on the tokens used. So for example, for the GPT 3.5 Turbo model, we have 0.2 cents for 1,000 tokens. This is why if we're looking at some of the requests that we have, we're looking here in the response body, we're going to find this property usage, and it's indicating us how many tokens we have used. Both the input and the output tokens matter. So the input is essentially our prompt. So in this example, our prompt has used 26 tokens. Then the response had 6 tokens, which in total makes 32 tokens. So we are going to be built for 32 tokens. It is important to configure the models in a way that they generate only the necessary amount of information. All these models have a maximum number of tokens that they can work with, around 4,000 tokens. But typically you don't need so much. So if you're noticing that your API usage is using really a lot of tokens and generating long responses when the responses should actually be shorter, you want to look at setting the max tokens property. By default, this is the maximum that the model allows. So 4,000 tokens in case of the GPT 3.5 Turbo model. So that's a lot of tokens. So if you're concerned about pricing, this is the kind of information you want to check. The good thing is that when you're using the API, you can control both the input and the output. The input totally depends on the amount of text that you put in the prompt, and the output depends on what you specified as a desired output in terms of the maximum amount of tokens that the model is allowed to use. The OpenAI API is not always guaranteed to work. Since its usage has recently skyrocketed, it is not improbable that you will experience availability issues, and this has happened in the past. I've added a link to the resources folder that takes you to this page. So if you're experiencing problems with the API, it's probably a good idea to take a look at this page and see if the API is operational. So the first thing that you should see here is the API listing, and you should see here if right now the API is available. So you'll notice here if in the last period there were any issues. But if you're looking here in the past, we're going to see that there have been some problems with this API since it has launched. So it's either very slow or you cannot reach it altogether. So generally speaking, if you cannot reach it altogether, you're not going to get a response. So Postman, essentially, we're just going to wait until it times out. Or the API may be responding, but it's throwing you a status 500 internal server error with some error in the response body, but so not something that comes back from the model itself. So if you're experiencing something like this, it's important to be aware of this page and take a look and see if the systems are operational. Of course, on this page, you can see also other systems that are available, including the Playground or the ChatGPT API and things like that. And you can review what has happened in terms of the availability of the OpenAI systems. Let's talk in more detail about the GPT 3.5 Turbo model. This model is more opinionated on how we provide a prompt and gives a predefined structure of messages and roles associated with each message. Essentially, we have three roles. We have a system role, we have a user role, and we have an assistant role. The system role is used only once in the beginning of the conversation, and is ideal for setting the context and configuring the behavior of the assistant. So typically, providing a context like you're a helpful assistant or you're translating messages from English to German is enough to get the assistant in the right mood, to put it like that. The next one is the user message, which is essentially, let's say, the typical prompt. This is where we're actually asking the AI something, or we want something from the AI. Strictly speaking, providing the system is not mandatory, so we could just start with the user itself. We can write something like, I'm writing an article about the ChatGPT API, can you suggest a title? In order to get this to work, we'll also have to remove assistant from here, and we can simply submit it as it is. So this will be essentially our prompt. But of course, this is a very simple requirement that we're having here. And particularly if you're trying to build a conversational bot, having here in the system more context is very useful. However, when working with this model, it's important to understand that there are system messages, there are user messages, and there are also assistant messages. What's maybe a bit surprising is that we can also configure the assistant messages. So for example, this message that is here, we're sending here an additional message would be part of the conversation. For example, I can ask to provide a different title, so to make a different suggestion. And of course, the conversation that we had previously is important for the AI to understand what has happened before. So we're essentially providing the entire conversation. If this sounds still a bit confusing, don't worry, because in the upcoming lectures, we're going to go through different examples and you're going to get very familiar with system, user, and assistant messages. In this lecture, we will be building a chatbot for a pizzeria. We will use messages to instruct the assistant with examples of the desired behavior. So let's get started. We're going to begin with the playground, and I'm here inside the chat mode, and the model is GPT 3.5 Turbo. We're going to start here with the system message, and let's provide the following content. So let's say we have a pizzeria, and we want to use this model to help people place an order. So we can initialize our model by something like, your name is Giuseppe and you're an assistant for a pizzeria named Pizzeria Valentino. Try to be helpful. This would be the system message. Now let's imagine that our pizzeria only has 4 types of pizza. At this point, our model is not very helpful. And if someone asks, like, what do you have on the menu? Or something like that, our bot will not be able to answer this because this knowledge is specific to our pizzeria and to our own use case. So what we're going to do next is we're going to use these messages to essentially instruct the model how to respond to such messages. So for example, we're going to provide a message and we're going to say, what kind of pizzas do you have? If we would run this as it is right now, we're going to get here essentially an answer generated by the AI. But this is not true. Our pizzeria doesn't have everything that it says here on the menu. This is when the instructing of the model starts. We're going to remove this message here and actually write our own message. You see here, this is an assistant message, but we're going to say here that we only have, and we're going to write here the kind of pizzas that we have. So let's say we have margherita, we have prosciutto e funghi, and we also have quattro formaggi. So this is everything that we have. Now we have provided additional context to our model. Now the model knows through this conversation history what kind of pizzas do we have. So if someone else asks what kind of pizzas are available, this information is already there. So for example, if we start here a message and we say, hello, I would like to order a pizza. Then let's say what our model now responds. So now the model has information about the kind of pizzas we have. So we have margherita, prosciutto e funghi, and quattro formaggi. This is how we now have instructed the model by providing an already existing question. Apart from this, what's very interesting is that the model is kind of smart. So for example, if someone asks here, do you have 4 cheese pizza, which is another name for quattro formaggi, the model should be able to answer this. So here is the answer that is coming from the assistant. Okay, the main idea was just to demonstrate that we can provide also assistant messages. And with these assistant messages, we are controlling how the models should react to different messages. And we're providing information that's specific to our use case and not something that's generic and that's already in the model. Let's take a look at how we can implement this in Postman. So if we go back in Postman, we already have this OpenAI collection. So I'm going to go ahead and make a copy out of it where we will be storing all GPT 3.5 Turbo requests. So I'm going to select from the list duplicate. I'm going to go ahead and rename this in GPT 3.5 Turbo. There's only one request that we're still interested in, and this is this chat completion, which uses the chat completions endpoint. And the rest of the request is something that we're going to go ahead and delete. So I'm going to go ahead and select them all. And want to make sure that this request is still working. In this case, we have a problem with the API key because as we have copied this collection, the API key went missing. So this is something that we still need to put inside here. I'm going to grab a valid API key and save it inside here. Let's take a look if this chat completion is still working properly. We're getting back status 200 OK, so that's good. Let's also go ahead and rename it. So this will be a conversational bot. And the example is with Pizzeria Valentino. So let's jump to the body and take a look at the messages that we have here. So we have a system message, a user message, and what we also need to provide is the assistant message. So I'm going to simply delete all the information that is already available there. I'm just going to write here assistant. So now from the playground, I'm going to copy the system message. I'm going to provide it here in system. It's important that this is on a single line. It's going to be broken here, but you can see it's a single line and the JSON here is valid. There's nothing red being indicated. I'm going to copy one of the user messages. I'm also going to copy one of the predefined responses that we're providing here. So this is something that we already have with every request as a minimum for our bot. Now the next part is the one where we now have the user input. And for this user input, we're actually expecting something from the model. So this is essentially the interface. If we were to build something, this is where we would put the input that is coming from our end user. So the end user will start here writing something like we had here. So I would like to order a pizza, right? So this is something that the user would then write. And we're not providing a response. So the training ends here. So this is where the AI starts working. So let's see the AI in action and take a look at how this is being responded to. So it says here, hello, great. May I have your order, please? So there's a different message this time. And of course, if we want to continue this conversation in the next request that we're sending to the API, we would need also to provide this assistant message here. So that the assistant, if there was an important message in between, knows what they said previously. So this is something that's very important to remember. When we're building these conversations, every upcoming message must have the entire history. Otherwise, the model has no idea what they said previously. But anyway, for this use case, it's something that we don't need anymore. The main idea was just understanding that we can provide the system message to set the context, and then we can instruct the model with examples, and we have provided here one example, one question and one example, how we would like ideally the model to answer that particular question. Let's imagine that we want to use this model to provide a summary of a larger text. I'm here inside OpenAI Playground. I have the mode chat selected, and the model is GPT 3.5 Turbo. So here as a system message, I can write something like you're a helpful assistant that provides a summary of every text entered by the user. And this can be already our system message. I'm going to go here to a Wikipedia article. I'm going to copy a block of text. There are a lot of facts inside here, so it's not going to be easy for the AI to provide a summary. But for this example, it will be enough. So I'm going to paste all this text here as a user message. And I'm going to simply go ahead and run submit. So what we'll see here as an assistant message is what comes back. So this is short summary of everything that is in this larger text. So this is how you can provide a summary, but this is not actually the thing that I wanted to show you. What I wanted to show you is how to make a request from Postman that has all this text. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this text here. So let's go back into Postman, and we can just simply duplicate the previous request that we have, and we can rename it into summary. So this is what we're trying to do. Let's take a look here inside the body. There are a few messages that we don't need, so we're going to remove those. So we're going to have here a system message, and we're also going to have here a user message. So let's start with the system message. You can simply copy this from the OpenAI Playground and paste it here. And additionally, we can also take this longer message that we have here and paste it here inside the content. So what we'll see as soon as we do this, everything will turn into red. So nothing will work anymore. And this is not valid JSON. So if we're trying to send this, we're going to get back an error telling us that the JSON body could not be parsed. So there's definitely something wrong with our request. So I'm going to undo this change that we have here. So in order to actually send this multi-line text, we need to do a few things. In the resources folder, I've included a script that we'll be using here. So if we now go to the pre-request script and paste the script that you will also find attached as a resource to this lecture, you should see something like this. Of course, I'm going to provide some improvements over time to these replacements that happen here. But essentially, there are a few things that we need to replace. We need to replace new lines. We need to replace some special characters to actually make our text a valid JSON. So let's go ahead, copy this text that we have here. And I want you to notice here that these are backticks here. This allows us to define a JavaScript variable, which is called user message. It allows us to write it here on multiple lines. So this is where our user message will be. And this is just necessary in order to use this in Postman. It's not so easy to work with so much text all of a sudden, but with these AI models, quite often we are working with a lot of text that we need to process before we actually send to the AI. So this is just a small hack that we need to do. But essentially, we're writing our text inside this JavaScript variable. We're doing some processing here, and then we are storing it in a Postman variable called user message. So if we go here to the body, I'm going to write here 2 braces. I'm going to close them also at the end. So this is the syntax for a variable in Postman. And what Postman will do, we will take this variable that has been created here in the pre-request script, and it will use it as the request has been sent. Let's go ahead and send this request once again. And what we're getting back is now the summary, which is available here. And you will see here the role assistant. So this is coming back from the AI. So this is how, with a bit of tricks, we can work with Postman and provide multi-line text. It's definitely not as easy as working here with the Playground. But if we're trying to integrate the API in our own applications, it's important to understand how the API works. And sometimes we need to deal with these kind of things. So one last thing, I'm going to rename this in multi-line message so that we know that this is the example where we have multi-lines, where we have the script, because this may be useful in the near future. Have you ever wondered why the text inside ChatGPT is displayed in chunks and not all at once? Initially, I thought this is just a visual effect to reduce the number of requests the user can submit or something like that. But it's not that, or not only that. Some responses take some time to get, even 10 seconds. Now, we don't want our users to wait so long and not get any visual feedback. In our example so far, this was not the case. Sometimes when we're using the chat completions API, we have to wait a lot. So in that time, we cannot display anything in our apps, which is less than ideal. However, if we're looking in the API documentation, and we are here in the API reference under chat for the chat completions, there is one interesting option that we need to consider, and this option is the stream option. So let me show you what this stream option does, which by default is set to false. I'm going to jump back to Postman and I'm going to duplicate the previous request. Let's rename this streaming output. We can leave the body and the pre-request script as they are, but the change that we want to make is actually here. So under model, I'm going to add a new property which is called stream. And as I mentioned previously, by default, stream is false, but let's set it to true. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this. And what we're going to see here is something very weird. First of all, look here at the time. This is constantly changing. Look at the size. This is also changing. Essentially, what is happening here is that we are getting this response in chunks, in smaller chunks. So these are like individual messages, and it's quite a lot of them because there's a lot of text. But it starts here. It says connected to this completions endpoint, and it ends somewhere here at the top when the last message comes, and then the connection is closed. So this is essentially the streaming of this message. We are getting everything as it happens. So right from the beginning, we're already getting some data. We are getting a token by a token. So let's look here somewhere in the middle. We click on one of these. Let me make this a bit larger. We're going to see here, we're getting essentially a delta, getting a piece of information, intelligence. And then if we're looking at the next message, since. So it's one token at a time. And if we use this streaming property, then we can also get this content one at a time. Look, for example, at the difference between using this option, so we are getting some messages instantly, to setting here stream to false. Exact same input. We're waiting and waiting and waiting and still waiting. And finally, after 11 seconds, we have the entire response. Let's change this back to true. These are called server-sent events. Obviously, seeing this in Postman is not very practical because you have to go through each and every message. But if you want to implement this in your own application and replicate the way ChatGPT is displaying text, then this stream property is definitely something you should consider. One way to control the model is by limiting the length of the output by specifying a maximum number of tokens in the response. If you look at the API documentation, we are here under chat and we're doing a chat completion. We'll be able to find this setting here, which is called max tokens. Max tokens says the following: the maximum number of tokens allowed for the generated answer. By default, the number of tokens the model can return will be 4096 minus prompt tokens. So by default, the maximum tokens used in the response is also the maximum that the model can generate. Based on our use case, we should have a general idea of how long the response needs to be. We rarely need the maximum the model can produce. Now I understand if this sounds a bit confusing, so I think it's better to take a look at some examples. I'm going to jump back to Postman and I'm going to copy this request summary. Let's go ahead and drag it down here. I'm going to rename it in max tokens. There's going to still be a summary, but we're going to use the property max tokens. So just as a short recap, we have here a large text, and our prompt is currently configured through a system message, and we're saying we are a helpful assistant that provides a summary of every text entered by the user. And this is where we're providing the text. Let's go ahead and run this. What we'll see here is what comes back. This is the summary that has been generated by the assistant. And we're also getting here information about how many tokens have been used. So I'm going to see our prompt has 424 tokens. Completion tokens were 165. And in total, we have used 591 tokens. So if you already have an idea of the kind of information that we're dealing with, so in this case, the maximum of 4096 tokens that this model can produce doesn't make any sense. This is not something that we will need. But let's see exactly how this influences what we're getting here. So we know that the completion has currently about 167 tokens. We can even run it once again. Now we're getting 224 tokens. Of course, this always varies. But let's go ahead and add here a property. And the name of the property is max_tokens. And let's say we're setting here max tokens to 100. So let's say we want an even shorter answer. So if we're looking here, completion tokens, 100. Our prompt hasn't changed, it's the same prompt. And in total, we have used now, of course, fewer tokens. But let's take a look at the response that we have here. What we'll see here is still some text, but at one point in time, this text ends. So what you need to understand about max length is that setting it will really make a hard cut. While setting a limit is probably a good idea, in practice you don't want to hit this limit too often. A common misconception is thinking that if you set a low max length, this will cause the model to make the response even shorter. Max length doesn't control the real length of the output. So this is not the use case for this. Setting this limit is useful to control the length of the model and to ensure it is not giving extremely long responses. This is also a way to control cost in case things don't work as expected. But if you need shorter responses, one way to control this is by designing a better prompt, where you can even explicitly mention how many words the response should contain. Now, it doesn't mean that the model will always take this in consideration, but that's where you want to be. So let's say, for example, we're making some changes here. So we're going to set here the max tokens to 1000. So just to make sure that we're not hitting any limits. And apart from this, we should also adapt a bit our prompt. So let's say, for example, we want the summary to contain 100 words. So we can amend our initial instructions that we have in the system and say here something like the summary needs to contain a maximum of 100 words. 100 words is not the same as 100 tokens, but that's a round number. So let's see how the model interacts with this. So as you can see here, now we have 131 completion tokens and we haven't hit that limit. So as you can see, we have managed to reduce the number of completion tokens used without hitting a limit. So when you're setting this limit, it should also contain a buffer. So if I know that I've instructed my prompt to generate responses that are about 100 words, 100 words is about like 125 tokens, then probably setting here a value of max tokens of 300 would be a good value for this use case. Setting it to low will cause the text to be abruptly interrupted, so this is also something that we don't want. There's one more important aspect you need to remember about max tokens. What you need to understand is that this is just a theoretical limit you can achieve. If you are sending a prompt with 3000 tokens and ask, for example, the model to rephrase it, the total token usage will be about 6000 tokens, which is above the maximum allowed. So just to recap, the token usage is counted as follows. The tokens in the prompt plus the tokens from the response equals the total number of tokens used. This value needs to be below the maximum number the model can process. So even if we set a maximum value of 4096, the response will contain so many tokens only if our input has no tokens at all, which is unrealistic. If you need a quick refresher in terms of tokens, all you have to do is open up this website, the tokenizer from OpenAI, link in the resources folder, and you can paste here your text and understand its size in tokens and better understand how the model operates in terms of tokens. One last thing, we mentioned here max tokens, but if you're looking here in the API documentation, you will also notice that there is no min tokens. Essentially, it's important to mention that currently you cannot set a minimum number of tokens that the model will generate. So you can set a maximum number of tokens, but you cannot say the response must be at least 100 tokens. All right. So in a nutshell, this is the usage of max tokens. Remember to set a value that's realistic for you and also add a bit of a buffer. But this is not something that you use to actually control the total length of the response that the model is generating. There are situations when we need to tell the model to stop generating text once we have reached a desired point. We can do that with a stop sequence. If we look inside the API documentation, one of the options available here is the property stop. So this property will allow us to configure essentially a token or multiple tokens, and when the model will detect that token in the response, it will stop. Let me show you an example so that you better understand what I mean. We're going to jump into Postman, and let's take the first request that we have here. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it. And let's drag it all the way down. And I'm going to go ahead and rename it into stop sequences. So we're going to go inside the body, and let's configure this a bit. So there are a few messages here that we don't need. I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And the system, we're going to add something more generic like you are a helpful assistant. All right. So let's say, for example, we want to ask the model to generate 10 titles for a travel book about Mexico. I'm going to go ahead and send this. And if we're looking here in the response, what we're going to see here is that we're getting a list of book titles, which is useful if we're writing a travel book about Mexico. Now, let's say, for example, the list that the model is generating is too long for what we need. Now, of course, we have said that we want 10 titles and the model has generated 10 titles. But let's just imagine that we have just said suggest some titles and we actually only need 3 titles, right? Now, in this case, we want to stop as soon as we're done with the 3rd title. So if we're looking here at the existing response, we're going to see here a character. And this is this backward slash n, and then it starts with 4 dot. So essentially, we want to, as soon as we are reaching here 4 dot, we want to stop. So essentially, before we reach 4 dot, we want to stop because it would include only 3 suggestions of titles. So once we have figured out what is the character or the token inside the response that we want to stop at, all we have to do is copy this. And I'm going to go ahead and under the model, let's add, for example, stop as a new property. And we're going to say, okay, when you're reaching this token here, for dot, which actually are 2 tokens, you should stop the generation. And what we expect is that for dot will no longer be part of the content that we're getting here. So let's see how this goes. So remember, we are still saying suggest 10 titles. And if you're looking here at the response, we're going to find the first title, we're going to find the second one, the third one, and after that it stops. And it stops because we have told the model, when you're encountering this particular token or tokens, you have to stop. Just to make sure you understand. Let's say, for example, we're asking the model to stop when the word Mexico is encountered, which means we're not going to have the word Mexico at all. Of course, this will absolutely break the response that we're getting back because it's not going to be able to generate anything useful. But this is it. It's stopping as soon as this is encountered. And actually, I would have expected that this is not part of it at all. Let's try it again. Discovering Mexico. So this is how we have now configured this stop character here. Let's add, for example, a space before it. And now we're going to see here, Mexico is now missing completely, right? Because it has matched this also with a space. So now we are actually not getting it at all. Exploring, so Mexico will not appear. Anyway, I just wanted to demonstrate how you can configure this. Of course, with a word like Mexico, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But the idea is to instruct the model a point where it needs to stop. Let me show you, for example, something more useful. For example, let's say that we are having a text that has 2 paragraphs, and we actually only need 1 paragraph. So again, I'm going to create a prompt in a way that the model will generate 2 paragraphs. So I'm going to say here, explain how the USA was founded in 2 paragraphs, right? So I'm explicitly requesting 2 paragraphs. I don't have any stop characters, so let's go ahead and run this. And if you're looking here, what do we have in the response? Let's see, this is the part where we have the paragraphs ending. So /n, these are essentially 2 new lines that we're getting here. So we want to stop as soon as we are encountering a new line, which shows that this is a new paragraph, we want to stop. So let's say this is our criteria. We only want 1 paragraph from the response. We never need 2 paragraphs. And for some reason, the model is generating us 2 paragraphs. So let's go ahead and configure our stop tokens. So we're going to write /n, /n. Let's hit again the send button. And if we're taking a look here at the response, we're going to see here that our text is ending here. So after these characters have been encountered by the model, the generation stops, and we're no longer getting 2 paragraphs. So these are like some of the use cases that you may want to consider if the output that is coming back doesn't really contain what you expected. So this is essentially the use of these characters. Of course, you can also specify up to 4 stop characters. So there may be situations where we need multiple characters. Currently, we only have 1, and this is represented here as a string. However, if you need to specify 4 of them, you need to put them in an array. So it's going to be a square bracket in the beginning, square bracket at the end. Of course, if you need multiple, you will just have to put them between quotes, another option, ABC, and so on. You got the idea. So this is how we can specify up to 4. You can go ahead and try and see if this is still working. Let's remove the spaces there. Now it's working properly. I admit these examples that I've presented here are fabricated to facilitate this demonstration. However, this can also be a useful thing to know if you notice that the model is not performing as expected. So of course, this is a way to ensure that the response doesn't derail. And for this reason, you can specify these stop sequences, which are then taken into consideration when the response is generated. In this section, we will use the knowledge that we have gathered in this course to build a simple ChatGPT clone using the OpenAI APIs. To help with the process, we will use ChatGPT to generate the code needed. For this, we will be building a web application using a web development framework called Next.js. Now, don't worry if you don't have any experience building something like this. In this section, I will guide you step by step through the process. So we'll not only be building a nice ChatGPT clone, but we will also learn how to effectively write prompts and build this application using ChatGPT. If this sounds like a cool project, let's jump into this. To build this project, we need to install a few tools. But don't worry, this can be done in just a few minutes. So let's begin. I'm going to open up a browser and search for Node.js. I'm going to go to nodejs.org. And this will be the download page. And I will put a link to this page in the resources of this lecture. It's very important that you install the LTS version and not the current version that you see here. So currently the LTS version is 18.17.0, but of course this will change in time. So always go with the LTS version. In just a few seconds, the installer will be downloaded. So I'm going to go ahead and open it. And the installation process for Node.js is pretty straightforward. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next here. Of course, I'm going to read the license terms, which I also recommend you do as well. Click on Next. I'm going to go with the default installation path for Node.js. Go with all the defaults in terms of the custom setup. I'm not going to check this one, so we can go with Next and then click on Install. In a nutshell, all you have to do is click on Next, 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 and you will be done with the installation in just a few seconds. Node.js is a platform that will allow us to run our application locally, so this is why we're installing Node.js. So the installation is now done, but there's no program or something that we can run. So the only way to check if Node.js has been properly installed is by opening a terminal window and checking the Node.js version. So let's do just that. I'm going to open here PowerShell. So Windows PowerShell will be the terminal that I'll be using. Let's go ahead and make this just a bit larger for you. I'm going to go here to font. And let's go with 24. Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to type here node -- version. To run this command, simply hit the Enter key on your keyboard. So what I'm going to get back is the Node.js version. We can also run npm, which is the Node package manager. And this is also automatically installed with Node. Sometimes npm does have the tendency to get outdated, so we want to make sure that we have the latest npm version because that will save us from having some issues later on. I'm going to type next npm install -g, which is for global. And what we're going to do, we're going to use npm to install npm and to make sure that we're getting the latest version. So we're going to specify this with @latest. Okay, so it seems that the installation has been successful and that we can continue. Next, we're not going to need a terminal, so we have installed Node.js. So this is our platform which will help us run the application. But we still need a code editor. So I'm going to use Visual Studio Code for actually writing this application. So if you don't have Visual Studio Code already installed, simply go ahead and search for Visual Studio Code. It's absolutely free to download and use. So I'm going to do just that. And I'm going to download the installer for Windows. Again, I'm going to put links in the resources folder so that you can easily do this as well. Let's go ahead and run the installer. And I can assure you this will also be a very simple installation process. Let's go ahead and, of course, read the license terms. Already did that. So I'm going to click here on Accept the Agreement. Click on Next. Check the path where this will be installed. I'm absolutely fine with what the installer is suggesting. I'm going to click on Next. We're also going to create a Start menu folder. And there are also some additional settings here that appear. If you want, you can also create the desktop icon. But apart from this, you can go with the default. And let's click on Install. And we can already launch Visual Studio Code. So let's go ahead and click on Finish. And this will be the interface that we'll be using to actually build our application. So let's go ahead and make this full screen. There are a few things that, help us get started. but essentially we can just mark everything is done. So now we have everything that we need up and running to be able to build this project. In this lecture, we're going to build the structure of our project. And for that, we're going to use a framework, a very popular one called Next.js. So don't confuse Node.js with Next.js. It's kind of like similar. Next.js actually runs on Node.js, which we have installed previously. So I'm going to type here Next.js. And I'm going to go directly to the start page. And again, I'm going to find links to all the commands that I'm typing inside the resources folder for every lecture. So in order to actually use this framework, we need to install it. And right here on the start page, there is a command that we need to run. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this command. And we need to open a terminal window to be able to execute this. So in case you don't already have PowerShell open or whatever terminal you're using, make sure that you're opening it again. Now, I want to store all these projects in a different directory. So I'm going to go ahead first and create a directory, which I'm going to call workspace. And for that, I'm going to use the command makedir. So this is the command that will create a new directory, space, and I'm going to type here workspace. Okay, so this directory has been created inside my user folder. So I'm inside users Valentine. All I have to do is write cd for change directory. I'm going to type here the first letters from this folder name, and I'm going to press tab after this. So I'm going to get this nice autocomplete so I don't have to type everything in. So now I'm inside my user folder and inside the workspace folder. So this is where I want to execute this command. So the command that we have previously copied, this one here. So again, if you don't have it, click here on this copy button or select everything and simply inside the terminal window, paste it. In case you're having issues pasting, there's also a context menu here. If you go on the icon, you'll see here which are the shortcuts for copy, pasting, and so on. All right. So right after this, I'm going to hit enter. And this will actually start the installation process for our project. And this is like essentially an installer that will take us step by step. So first of all, we're going to be asked if it's okay to proceed. So I'm going to go ahead and type here Y to continue. And now we're going to be asked like, how do you want to name this project? So I suggest naming the project Ask the AI with dashes in the name. And after this, there are going to be a few questions that we need to be very careful. Sometimes the defaults are as they should be, and sometimes you need to change them using the arrows. So between the arrows, you can navigate between yes or no. So for this project, we're going to use TypeScript. So currently yes is selected, so I'm going to go with that. We're going to use ESLint as well, so we're going to go with yes. We're going to use Tailwind CSS. This is something that is going to be very helpful for building the front end. So I'm going to select yes. We're going to use the source directory as well. So instead of no, if that's selected, go ahead and select yes. We're going to use the app router. So definitely go with yes. We don't want to customize the import alias. So we're going to go with no on that one. And right after that, what will happen here, and you'll see here, a new folder will be created, Ask the AI. So this is within workspace, within my current user. So this is essentially where we want to do all the development work. Okay, so the installation has been completed. Everything looks good. We are not getting any errors, so that's perfect. So in order to actually see what has happened, it is best if we can open this folder here and take a look at what we have inside. So for that, we're going to use Visual Studio Code. And we have here the option of opening a folder. Or if you cannot find this page, simply go to File and select Open Folder. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to go here to this Workspace folder. And inside the Workspace folder, I'm going to click Ask the AI, and I'm going to select the folder. If this is the first time when you're opening files with Visual Studio Code, we're gonna ask about if you essentially, trust the code that's inside there. So I'm gonna say here, yes, trust everything that is in the workspace. I trust authors, and this will no longer appear. Currently, the view is a bit small, so I'm gonna go here to the View menu, and from Appearance, I'm gonna use here Zoom In, but of course, you can also use the keyboard shortcut for that. So I'm just zooming in a bit so that we can better see what we have here. So on the left-hand side, this is where all the project files are. And we're going to get into them a bit later. But just so you know, these are like all the files that have been generated by this Next.js project installer, project initializer. We still cannot see anything, and that's a bit annoying. So what I want to do next is to actually start this project, see exactly what we have at this point. So for that, we're going to use a terminal, but because we will interact with the terminal a bit more, I don't want to just use the regular terminal and switch between these windows all the time. What I want to do is open a terminal within Visual Studio Code. So we can go ahead and close this tab here. We don't need it. And we'll see here terminal from the menu, and I'm going to select here new terminal. There's also a neat shortcut that you can use, which is Control and backtick. If you have that on the keyboard, that's also an option to make the terminal appear and disappear, or there's also a suggested shortcut as well. So this is the terminal, and it automatically opened within our project directory. So this is super important, right? So we need to be inside the project directory if we want to do something with this project. Perfect. So what do we want to do? Let's go ahead and start it. The command that we're going to use to actually start the application is going to be npm run dev. So what this command will do is will compile this code, make it in an application, create a local web server which exposes the application, and this allows us to build the application and at the same time see the output. Now, if you're getting an error when you're running this command, probably restarting your computer once will definitely help. Okay, so in this case, I don't see any errors, and the application has been exposed here on localhost port 3000. So all I have to do here is click on Control, and then, of course, this link will look like a link, so we can click on it. And what this will do is will automatically open our default browser, and this is our application. Now, this is just initial page that Next.js provides us. But at this point, essentially, we have managed to create this project, see the files that are inside the project, and run the application. Now, what's super important to understand about what we did at this point is that we have here a terminal window, but if you're clicking here on enter, trying to enter a different command or something like that, this will not work. And the reason for that is that when we ran this command, npm run dev, we have started the server, and this is continuously running. Of course, at one point in time, you may want this to stop. So if we want to stop this, or if you want to type in a different command or do something else, but we want to stop this server from running, all we have to do is press Control-C. So Control-C will ask us then, do you want to terminate this? So we can select yes. Sometimes pressing it 2 times or something like that will immediately stop it. In this state, our server is no longer running. So if we go back to our browser page and refresh this page, we're gonna get here an error because there's nothing running on localhost port 3000. So in a nutshell, this is how we can run our project, and this is how we can stop our project. In this lecture, we will use ChatGPT to build the user interface of our application. Use your OpenAI account and go to chat.openai.com, link in the resources folder, and go to this page. I'm going to use a free ChatGPT account to be able to demonstrate this. Before we actually start using ChatGPT, let's go back to our application and make a few small changes. So first of all, let's run our server again so that we can see the visual output of our application. So for that, I'm going to use my up key on the keyboard just to show the previous command that I have executed, which is npm run dev. So I'm going to run that once again. And typically it only takes a few seconds. Then I can switch to the browser and having here the application running on localhost port 3000. And this is how the application currently looks like. Now we want to build this ChatGPT clone or ask the AI using the ChatGPT API. But we don't need what we have right now on the screen. So we can make some changes to this page. And Next.js is helpful because it's telling us where this file is located that we can change. And this is in src source app page.tsx. So this is where we need to go inside our project. I'm going to expand the source folder, and it already contains the app folder. And this is what we have inside here. And we're going to go to the page.tsx. Now there's a lot of content here. So if we go here inside this code, there's like a lot of things that we don't need. So what we're going to do is carefully remove everything. Now, almost everything. There are still a few things that we need. But you will see here this return function here. And this return function ends here somewhere right at the end. So I'm going to remove everything that is within it. And now it should look something like this. We also don't need image here on top, so I'm going to remove that as well. So we only have export default, and this is our home page. So what we're going to do here, we still need a bit of content. We need like a super simple content. So we're going to write here a paragraph. So this is going to be our paragraph. Inside the paragraph, we can put some text. So I'm going to put a text, ask the AI, because this is the name of our application. I'm going to go ahead also and save this. You notice here, whenever you have unsaved changes, you're going to get this indicator here. So just take a look at it, at how it is changing. So now we have made the changes. And if we go back to the browser, what we'll see here is our application doesn't look so great. We have this ask the AI. But now we can start actually using ChatGPT. So what we're going to do in ChatGPT is we're going to craft here a message, which is prompt essentially. I'm going to start with the following prompt. I have a Next.js project that uses TypeScript with Tailwind CSS and a file with the following content. So let's go ahead and grab the content that we have here. We're just going to give ChatGPT the entire content that we have in this file. So this is the part where we are setting the context. We're telling that we have a Next.js project. We're saying that we're using TypeScript and that we are using Tailwind CSS for frontend and that we only have this file essentially. Now comes the second part. We want to give instructions on what should happen next. So for example, we can write something like this. My app requires the following design elements done with Tailwind CSS. Now you don't have to type everything in. I'm going to put all these prompts that I'm using as resources to this lecture. But I'm just trying to explain like what we're doing and the order in which we're doing things. We need a few things done using Tailwind CSS. And what do we need done? Well, we need a big text area. This is essentially when we are putting our inputs. This is when we're writing our prompts. So we need a big text area, and below it, we want a button which says Ask the AI. Above this, similar to ChatGPT, should be the conversation history between the assistant and the user. And we also want to make sure that all the user interface elements, UI elements, use the entire screen width so that we don't get something super small. And we're also adding like everything should be centered and nicely styled. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this, and let's see what ChatGPT comes with. Of course, we're going to be given instructions in terms of what we need to do. So it's going to tell us, you modify this particular page, right? And this is what we need to put inside the page. Okay, perfect. And there's also like an explanation in terms of like why particular CSS classes had been added and so on. But let's just go ahead and copy this code, put it inside our application. So I'm going to go ahead and actually replace everything that we have inside here. Right after saving, we should see that we have no errors here in the terminal. So if there's anything wrong, we're going to get an error here. And of course, we can move back to our browser. And let's see what we have here. And we already have, let's say, a decent user interface without doing very much. So let's see for a second how it works. Let's ask, for example, how many states are in the United States of America. Let's click on Ask the AI. Nothing happens. So we have a history, but our application currently is not really functional. So we need to give additional instructions in order to get this to work. Now, what you need to remember is that even if you use the same prompts as I do, AI models are non-deterministic. This means that your code and user interface might look a bit different. For your convenience, I've included the project code and all the prompts that I've used as a reference, so you can anytime download the project that I have at this point in time and run it locally. But again, we're just focusing on understanding the principles of using these prompts to build this application. Of course, we have some issues here, so what we need to do is provide a follow-up prompt so that we can fix some of these issues. Next, I'm going to say, create a function, ask the AI, and provide it with the input from the text area, because currently nothing happens when we write something in the text area. Answer with a standard message. Make sure everything is part of the message history. Right now we have a message history, but it's kind of like hard-coded and doesn't change, nothing happens. So I'm also seeing that initially the message history should be empty. So let's see what ChatGPT comes up with this time. So there's, of course, again, another explanation in terms of what is happening here. And the code has been updated. We have this ask the AI function here, but the purpose of this is not to get too much into the code. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this as it is and take it back to Visual Studio Code. In Visual Studio Code, to apply these changes, we're going to have to delete everything, paste it once again, and save this page. So what is happening next is that if you're taking a look at what we are doing after we have compiled this, we're going to get here an error. And this is expected because of two things. First of all, you need to understand that ChatGPT doesn't have knowledge about what has happened recently. So ChatGPT knows about Next.js, but currently it only knows the state of Next.js in 2021. So in the past years, few things have changed, and this code doesn't work exactly as it should work. So this is always something that you need to keep in mind. So in this case, to solve this issue, we actually need to specify that this file will be used in the front end. And we do this by simply using this use client. So we need to add use client at the top of our files. So it needs to be right here on top before import. And it should look something like this. So if we're saving this once again, we shouldn't get any error. So if we're going back to the browser, we're going to see that we no longer have a message history. So this is definitely a good thing. So let's ask again the question, how many states in the US? Let's click Ask the AI. And now we're actually getting this message history. So we're seeing here our input, and we're seeing here the assistant. Thank you for your question. Here is your answer. This is something standard, so we can just type in hello, and we're going to get back the same thing. But at least from a user interface perspective, we are coming closer, and we have managed to get this user interface to work by simply using ChatGPT. In this lecture, we're going to continue improving our application, and for that, we're going to create an API endpoint. Now, if you're not familiar with the term API, this is essentially something that runs a bit in the background. It's something where we can send, for example, the prompt that we're having here when we're clicking on Ask the AI and send it back to the server. So for that, we're going to create this API endpoint so that we can automatically update the interface and everything. So this is what we're going to try to do next. Let's open Visual Studio Code. And to create this API, we need to create a file in a specific location. So that specific location is in source app. And here inside app, you want to make sure that this is expanded. We're going to create a new folder. So this is a new folder. And I'm going to call this API. And again, we want to make sure that we have API selected. And we're going to create another folder there, which we're going to call OpenAI. And again, clicking on OpenAI, we want to make sure that that is open as well. We're going to create a file. And that file is going to be called root.ts. And initially, this will be an empty file. So what we want to do is we want to tell ChatGPT that we have this empty file and that we want to create an API inside it. So let's take a look at how we can do this. Let's go ahead and open ChatGPT and continue the conversation that we're having here. The prompt I'm going to use is something like this. I have the following empty file. So I'm just giving ChatGPT context about what we're trying to do. There's a slight problem that we have here, and that is the way these endpoints are created with Next.js has changed, and we need to provide ChatGPT with some additional information. So this is why I'm going to say here, hey, look, kind of like, don't use what you already know, use the latest information that I'm going to provide you here. So I'm going to say here, use the following information from the documentation to expose a post endpoint. So this is one type of the API endpoint. And in the body, there's a property query, which needs to be parsed. So this is again something technical. Simply respond with a JSON object with a property response and the same value as the query. Write the code using TypeScript. So these are again technical information that we're telling ChatGPT in order to construct this API endpoint. So this is where, we're getting a bit technical. So we need to know from a developer perspective, like what we're trying to do. If we have no idea like what we're trying to do and how we would build this application, it's very hard to develop applications with ChatGPT. It's not like we can just simply say, okay, build this automatically and ChatGPT will read our mind and will know exactly what needs to be done. So we need to take ChatGPT step by step. And it does help a lot if we know a bit of programming. So if you don't know programming, of course, this will be like, what post endpoint, JSON and everything. Okay, I understand it's a bit harder, but if you understand the underlying ideas, I'm going to be very happy. And I think you're going to be happy by the end of this as well. So next, what we're going to do here, we need to provide an example. I'm going to write here. Here is an example from the latest Next.js documentation that you should take into account. So I'm going to go to the Next.js documentation, and I have here an example on how this should be done with TypeScript. So just going to go ahead and copy this. And the link to this page is also in the resources folder. So in this case, this is how we're providing ChatGPT more context. This is how we can provide information about things that ChatGPT doesn't know, so that ChatGPT can still create useful code, even if it's not connected to the latest information available. So this is essentially what we have now in this file. So it has created this, but if you're looking here, you'll see here export default function handler, and we can see it looks different, right? So we can go ahead and ask again ChatGPT, hey, have you used the example provided? So let's see what ChatGPT has to say about this. And it typically, yeah, I'm sorry. But still, it's not what we wanted, right? So we still need to push back. So for example, we notice here export default function handler. We again need to tell ChatGPT, no, it's not handler. It should be called as in the documentation. So again, I'm saying here, look, the name of the function should be post and not handler, as in the example given. And again, sorry for the oversight and things like that. So, at least at this point, it looks closer to what it should be, right? So if you compare it to what we have here, it does look a bit better, but still not exactly what we wanted. So in some situations, ChatGPT is really, really struggling with it. So of course we have different options. We either just, ignoring what ChatGPT is saying, and we're just going to use what we have here. Or of course we can use ChatGPT and still continue this conversation. But sometimes, ChatGPT doesn't really get it. Of course, it depends a bit on the model. This is the GPT 3.5 model. GPT-4 model may be slightly a bit smarter about this and be able to create something more useful. So in this case, I'm going to give up on ChatGPT for this particular example, and I'm going to use a piece of code that I know is working. So in this case, instead of just providing the example with post, what we can do is copy the example with post, but also go a bit up, show also the example with get, and essentially provide more context and more examples. So I'm just going to go all the way to the top here, explaining how to use root handlers. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And going back to the conversation, what we need to do is locate our original message that we have. Because what we're going to do is we're going to make changes to that. So this is the original message where we have the prompt, where we're saying what we need to do, and where we're referencing the Next.js documentation. So you'll find here this edit button that you need to click. And this will allow you essentially to make changes to this. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the example originally provided. And paste from the documentation the longer example. If you scroll a bit down, you'll find here Save and Submit. You can go ahead and click on that. And now what we'll get here is essentially another example. So as you can see here, it does look a bit different. It does use what we expect. So let's go ahead and copy this code. Jump back to Visual Studio Code and paste it inside the file route.js. Now we have created this endpoint, but we need to connect it with our front end. So to do that, we're going to go back to ChatGPT and we're going to write here a new message. So the prompt will be inside the page.tsx file, change the handle ask AI function to make an API call to /API/OpenAI. This is the endpoint that we have just created, and send the query in the body. So what ChatGPT will do is to suggest changes to our code so that we can actually accomplish this. Now, be very careful, because right now, here you will see here, we're not getting everything back, right? So we're only getting a small snippet, and it's essentially only the handle ask AI function that we need to change. So super, super important. So I'm going to go ahead and copy only this code. Go to Visual Studio Code. And select the page.tsx file. So this is the ask.ai function, right? So this is where we need to put code that we have. So in the page itself, we will not see any errors, but actually we have now changed the name of the function. So I said here, ask the AI, and now the name of the function is handle ask the AI, so they need to be the same. So this is the code that will be generated. And there's a lot in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply go ahead and copy the code. Sometimes ChatGPT will only give you a snippet, so it's also important to just browse the code to see if there are any comments indicating that only a part of this has been provided. It doesn't look like that, so we can simply copy this. And we're going to go back here. We're going to make sure that we keep use client, but we can go ahead and remove the rest. Right, so there are no errors that we're seeing here. We can go back to the browser and let's check on our application to see what's going on here. So I'm going to write here, hello. Let's see what is happening. What we're getting back here is hello. So it seems that we haven't achieved so much, but actually if we look behind the scenes, we did quite a lot. So let me explain why this is the case. I want you to right click until you see this inspect button within the page. This will essentially open the developer tools. And this is a very powerful tool whenever we're working with web applications. So what our application does, actually in the background, it is sending an HTTP request to our API that we have created. So let me show you how this works. So you see here network. And if you want to easily see this, you're going to select this filter fetch /XHR. So this will show us only some specific requests that we're interested in. So let's go ahead and type here hello once again and see what exactly is happening. So we're going to ask the AI. What we're going to see here, this is a request that is being sent to our endpoint. So you'll see here localhost port 3000 /API/OpenAI. We have a payload. We're seeing here, this is the query and the message is hello. And the response that we're getting from our API is hello. So this shows that what we did in terms of creating this API and putting everything together shows that it has worked. So we have these pieces where we're connecting the front end with the back end. So currently our chatbot is not really useful because it is giving back what we have already provided as a prompt. In this lecture, we're gonna use the OpenAI API in our application. So for that, we're gonna use a library. OpenAI provides two official libraries, one for Python and one for Node.js. But you also see here a list of community libraries for essentially any programming language and framework out there. Now going back to Node.js, this is what we're going to use in this case. Now, why do we need this library? Well, we could make the HTTP request directly to the OpenAI API. But this library is essentially a wrapper that makes our life a bit easier. So let me show you what I mean by that. The first thing that we need to do is to install this library. So this is the command that we need to run, npm install OpenAI. There's also a copy link here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. Go back to Visual Studio Code, and with Control-C, we're going to stop our server, right? So we are not going to have this server running anymore. And then we can simply go ahead and paste this command, hit enter, and install it. Of course, I also have here this $sign. I don't know why that got copied as well. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that and hit enter once again. The installation should only take seconds. And at this point in time, you will not see any difference. So what we need to do is to integrate this OpenAI library inside our code. And the best place to do that is inside our route.ts, because this is where we want to make the API call. So what do we want to do here? Well, it's relatively simple. Jumping back at the documentation, what we'll see here is that we need to import a few things. We need to essentially import this configuration that we see here. So we can go ahead and copy this. And we can simply put it here, just the line before this import statement. Now, there are two different ways of importing a library. This is, let's say, an older style with require. So we can simply use, instead of const here, we're going to write here import. And instead of require, I'm going to say here from, and we're going to say that we are importing from OpenAI. I'm also going to go ahead and replace the double quotes with single quotes for consistency. The next step that we need to do is to configure it. And part of this configuration is to provide the API key. So there is this configuration object that we need to create. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this code as well. And we're going to also copy this OpenAI object. So I'm going to copy these lines here. And we can do this right outside this function. Now, in this case, we're configuring OpenAI and we are creating essentially a new OpenAI object, which we can then later use in our code. But in order to actually use OpenAI, we need an OpenAI API key. You see, we are referencing it here, but we haven't defined it anymore. So in order to define it, what we actually need to do is to provide it as an environment variable. Because this application is only running locally on our computer, what we need to do is go here to the project root. So we want to make sure that we are at this level. I'm going to go ahead and create a new file. And the name of the file will be .env. So it starts with a .env.local. It is super important that the name of the file is exactly as you see it here. If it's not the same name, not going to be picked up by Next.js when the application starts, and then you will not be able to connect to the OpenAI API. So in this file, what we're going to do here, we're going to add a key. So the name of the key is OpenAI _API _key. This is the exact same key as we have it in our code. I'm going to write equal, and what we're going to do here is we're going to add an API key. So from platform.openai.com, go to the API keys and simply create a new API key. And as an optional name, you can provide here, Ask the AI app. And go ahead and create the API key. Next, copy it, go back to Visual Studio Code, and paste it inside here so that it can be picked up when the application starts. Going back to the Node.js library, there are still a few things that we need to do. And this is to create a chat completion, right? So we want to create a chat completion. This means that we're going to use the GPT 3.5 turbo model to get something out of OpenAI. So I'm going to copy this next code snippet. And then I'm going to go to the route.ts file. And we're going to write this when we have the query object, right? So this is when we're getting the input from our application and we can start doing something with it. So we are creating here the chat completion. And what we can do here is we have the role user, and as a content, we can directly provide the query. So we don't need to provide something like hello world. We can directly provide the query that we have. Now here, when it comes to the response, we're going to make some changes there. So this is a bit more complicated or a bit longer to write, but essentially we're going to replace this entire response object here. Simply go ahead and remove this line. And also remove the return from here. And as a snippet, you will find the code that I'm going to write here. So this is what we'll be pasting next response. And then from the chat completion object, we're going to access data property choices. So it's a more complex object that is coming back. So we're just going to get a part of it. Don't worry about this part showing here in red. It's just telling us that there's a possibility that something will not work. But this is essentially what we need at this point to get this to run as we need to. So let's go ahead and start this application once again. So what is important to notice here in the logs is that our .env.local file has been picked up. And this is super important because it also contains the key. All right. So now there are no errors while starting this application. So let's go back to the browser and ask something like, how many states in the USA? And click on Ask the AI and wait just for a second. And what we're getting back here is the response from OpenAI. There are 50 states in the United States of America. We can capture an input, send it to the OpenAI API, get a response, and show that response here. Of course, it's not perfect. It doesn't have all the features that ChatGPT has, but it does go to show how you can integrate ChatGPT in your own applications and how you can use ChatGPT to build everything, front end and back end at the same time. If you are getting any errors or you're getting no response, first of all, it's super important that you check your API key. So go back to Postman, check if that API key actually works, and make sure that you haven't, added any spaces or anything like that when you have written it. Of course, you can go back to ChatGPT and say, hey, provide some error handling or provide a message if an API call fails or something like that. So there's definitely more layers that can be added to this. Of course, I will also add this code as a resource to this video. And of course, I will also add the code that I'm currently using as a resource to this lecture. From a user interface standpoint, there's still a few things that I don't really like. For example, if I'm typing here a message and I'm clicking the Ask the AI button, there's a period of a few seconds when nothing is happening. And what's even worse, I can click this button, for example, for multiple times. So I'm clicking here Ask the AI 5 times, and look at what is happening here in the user interface. So this is something that I would definitely like to change. So let's go back to ChatGPT and improve the UI. So the first thing that we will do is to simply ask ChatGPT to disable the button after it is clicked. So let's see what are the code improvements that are coming with this. So let's go ahead and copy the updated code. Go into Visual Studio Code. And here I'm going to keep use client, but remove all the rest. All right, let's go ahead and save the page so that we can rebuild the application. Okay, so the client and the server have been successfully rebuilt. So all we have to do is go back to the application and let's try again. So I'm asking my question here. So let's click on Ask the AI and see what is happening this time. You will see here now it says processing, so it doesn't let me do anything else. And then now we have this visual indication that something is happening, the request is being sent, and then we're getting back the response. Okay, so it is a bit better, but still not perfect. I'm not very happy with how these messages look like. So let's go ahead and try to make them a bit nicer. Going back to ChatGPT, let's try something like put each message in its own text box for better visual separation. Let's see what ChatGPT comes up with. Alright, so we have here the explanation and the code. I'm going to go ahead and copy this and replace it in our project. Again, make sure to keep here use client in the beginning. So this is the application. This is how it looks like now. So essentially now each message is in its own text box. Of course, we can go even further, ask for additional modifications, ask it to put it in different colors and so on, but should be enough for now.